If you're looking at this video, you're either thinking of doing the module on the development of the Christian canon, or you have begun to study the module on the development of the Christian canon. The Bible. You can buy one in the shops. You probably have half a dozen copies around your house. Everyone knows it. They can present you a copy in a courtroom and you can swear on it. But how did the book come together? That is the fundamental question of canon. Or in the words of Bruce Metzger, is this an inspired list of biblical books or a list of inspired biblical books? The contents page was not included in the revelation that produced the books. Or, put another way, the books existed long before they ever came together in the collection that we call the Hebrew Bible, the larger collection we call the Septuagint, or the even larger collection that we call the Bible, or one of its other sub-collections, the New Testament. So this module is looking at how the Christian church evolved by the 4th century to have a book with a fixed set of contents, more or less like the Bible you would buy today. So let's start at the end. By the closing years of the 4th century, Augustine is able to produce, 396 to be exact, a list of the books of the Old Testament and a list of the books of the New Testament that would remain the standard large canon governing the production of Bibles in the West down to today. Just a few years earlier, and which had provoked Augustine to provide his list, Jerome had equally produced a list of books, and that is the books, the short canon of the Old Testament, leaving out some of the wisdom literature and some historical books such as 1 and 2 Maccabees, and he had produced the same list of New Testament works. How did that collection come together? What influenced the coming together of the collection, and what was the impact of the coming together of the collection, are the three main themes that run through the units of this module. First of all, there's the idea of a collection itself. We know that there were collections of books in use at the time of Jesus. It's taken for granted by the first disciples that they can refer to the scriptures, and there is the reference to the law and the prophets. And we know that already the distinction of law, prophets and writings was in use. But it's only in the 1st century, and probably in the period after the First Revolt, that a hard canon, a canon in the sense of saying these are in and everything else is out, emerges within Judaism. The early Christians were using canon in a softer sense. These are definitely in, and then there are grey areas on the edges that no one knew what to do with. So, for instance, the work that we now call 4 Ezras is a lovely example of this. It was written in the 2nd century of the Christian era by a Jewish author who knew nothing of Christianity, or at least shows no signs of knowing anything of Christianity. Within a few years is translated into Greek. It then gets a Christian foreword and a Christian afterword. And by the late 2nd century, it is already being treated as part of the Old Testament canon. So, in the 2nd century, while rabbinic authorities are producing a hard canon, these are in and everything else is out, Christian authors are still using a soft canon. These are in and we don't know what is out. Gradually, that attitude would change, and a hard canon of the Old Testament would provide a model for a hard canon of the New Testament. So that is something we have to look at in this module. But in a sense, the canon of the Old Testament was largely a done deal and was taken over by the Christians. More interesting is how a distinctively Christian canon emerged, so that later Christians would write and would speak and write about earlier Christian writings and give them the same authority as the Scriptures. So how was it that by the end of the 3rd century, and Eusebius of Caesarea's work, his church history is a very good example of this, we see there that Christian writers are already giving to earlier Christian writers the status of treating them as authoritative scripture on a par with Moses and the prophets. The process is a very complex one. For instance, we know that Paul, his letters are coming together. By the middle of the 2nd century, there is a canon. And by that time, a lot of other work has been added to Paul's initial writings, Ephesians and Colossians, 2 Thessalonians. And then there are other works which are attributed to Paul, but are even later, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. The core was certainly forming a canon by the middle of the 2nd century. And by the time Eusebius writes, the Pauline canon includes original Paul, Deutero-Paul, and Pseudo-Paul. And someone like Jerome is in two minds as to whether Hebrews goes in or not, and will change his mind at various times. The evolution of the gospel canon is a different process yet again. Here we see a group of preachers, some of whose works become famous because they are also written down, and they gradually canonize one another. Mark is canonized by becoming part of Matthew and Luke. And that process continued onwards, in that we find that in the 2nd century there are other Gospels, the Gospel of Peter being a good example, that are retelling those stories and giving them new shape. And yet, 4 texts, certainly by the end of the 2nd century, and most probably by the middle of the 2nd century, from the evidence of Tatian, a disciple of Justin, are gaining a unique authority among those writings that are seen to belong to the genre of gospel. So we have to look at how gospels are being transmitted, how the concept of gospel is itself developing, and then thirdly, how those texts relate to the other gospels that we now call the apocryphal gospels. And then there are the other writings. How did they come together? There was never any committee meeting which sat down and said, here are the criteria. That's a later imaginary construct of theologians. They were canonized because they were found to be useful and because they had already developed a tradition of being, these are the ones we always used. So part of the module is to see these processes at work and how the rationalization, uniformity, consistency, ubiquity, these are later explanations of the fact that these were the writings that were being already considered scripture. And then there's one other theme in the module, and that is, what was the effect on the way those people who were the first to use the concept of New Testament scripture, of being able to have some Christian writings which were being put in this wholly unique category of sacred scripture. In the 2nd century, people were still saying they preferred the living voice to the written word. By the early 4th century, people are saying they much prefer the written word to the living voice. And that would have profound implications, not only for how they did theology themselves, but for the way they read the books that were now canonical. It's sometimes said that one of the greatest problems facing the history of theology is how the 2nd century interpreted and handed on its legacy from the 1st century. When we study the question of canon, we are looking at the outcome of that transmission and how, in creating a New Testament canon, this 4th century list has changed the way theology is done among Christians ever since. Good luck with the module.